After more than a month, federal law enforcement agents are finally leaving Portland.
For weeks, federal agents have occupied downtown Portland. They have refused accountability and brought violence and strife to our community.
Masked, heavily armed, unidentified men have beaten, shot at, and tear-gassed protesters. They've abducted people off the streets, using unmarked vans to take them to unknown locations. These paramilitaries were sent by President Trump, despite pleas by local elected officials for them to leave. But Trump's order would likely not have been possible without the legal framework created by the almost 20-year-old War on Terror. Portland is a story of how that war has come home.
Antifa is a domestic terrorist organization
and been turned against Americans. Some might say that unidentified federal agents abducting and tear-gassing protesters could only happen under a Trump presidency. But this moment has been a long time in the making. In the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, the US government launched what it called the Global War on Terrorism. This was, the government claimed, a new type of war that needed new rules and tactics. Abroad, that meant the US used torture, assassinations, and extraordinary renditions. That's abducting suspects and sending them to other countries for interrogation. At home, the Bush administration created the Department of Homeland Security.
Security Act of 2002 takes the next critical steps in defending our country. The continuing threat of terrorism, the threat of mass murder on our own soil, will be met with a unified, effective response.
22 different federal agencies were folded into DHS. It was the biggest government reorganization in decades, but it also reset how US policy was made, especially regarding immigration.
After 9/11, immigration comes to be seen as the handmaiden of terrorism, as a path by which America is under threat. And all of a sudden, immigration becomes not part of a glorious American history, but as part of a continuum of American danger.
This is Spencer Ackerman. He's been reporting on the War on Terror for almost all of its duration. He's currently writing a book called Reign of Terror about that war's influence on US culture.
The term you heard a lot around the 2002-2003 era when DHS gets set up is that terrorists have used America's open society against it. What went often unsaid, but got entrenched into the architecture of American institutions, was that America was going to give up in important ways on having that kind of open society. And for a very long time,
the loss of some civil liberties was felt by certain communities, especially Muslims, right after 9/11, with widespread surveillance, arrests, and deportations. But by turning immigration into an issue of national security, the enforcement of immigration policy inside the US would become militarized. One of the agencies created within DHS was Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
And so where the effects of this go quickly is to take whomever is in the country in an undocumented status and subject them to really strong crackdowns. And a lot of the sort of terror that you've seen people on the streets of American cities experience from federal agents, that was felt very acutely as early as 15 years ago.
Who are you? Do you have identification? Because
no, I don't need to present you with anything.
ICE and another DHS agency, Customs and Border Protection, targeted immigrants and their communities with heavy force. Now, the US Constitution protects Americans from random and arbitrary stops and searches, but the US government says these protections don't fully apply at the border, where CBP is in charge. But here's the issue. CBP's jurisdiction actually spreads 100 miles inside that border. What's crazy is that 200 million Americans, more than 2/3 of the population, live in this zone. In other words, agents from a government department set up for the War on Terror can operate against much of the US population.
The creation of the War on Terror, whether it's the ability to launch unconstitutional and illegal bulk surveillance, to detain people without charges on understandings of them as enemy combatants, and in extreme cases, particularly at the beginning of the War on Terror, to torture people. All of these authorities that began after 9/11 have never gone away. And the way that executive authorities operate is that unless they were aggressively checked, they spread. The war on terror was designed from that spread from the start. By design, it is unlimited.
Now, that spread hasn't just come in the way heavily armed law enforcement agents deal with people in the street, but in the language that US politicians use.
Antifa is a domestic terrorist organization.
Is being burned by essentially improvised explosive device, being blinded by lasers. Is this something that typically happens with federal marshals?
I've reported from Iraq, I've reported from Afghanistan, I've seen from people I've interviewed the effects of IEDs on people, the devastation that they cause. There's just nothing like this in American protests. And I think they know that. I think the point of using this language is the same purpose that always happens in wars: dehumanization.
The language of counterterrorism has gone from being used against foreign enemies to immigrants, and now the Republican Party's domestic opponents. And that's one thing that has accelerated under the Trump administration. The president and his allies frequently ridicule leftist or anti-Trump or Black Lives Matter protests as organized by Antifa. Antifa isn't an actual organized group. It represents an ideology of anti-fascism. That's what the word Antifa stands for. When President Trump announced that he was going to officially declare Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, a lot of people pointed out that legally he couldn't really do that. Ackerman thinks there's still an important message in his threat.
It showed that our cultural understandings of these issues had merged together in a way that makes it extremely conducive for politicians to crack down on domestic dissent. This is something that at the beginning of the 9/11 era was seen as paranoia, and right now we're seeing it manifest.
In fact, DHS documents leaked to the nation show the department is trying to tie some activists it considers Antifa to foreign organizations. The use of war on terror language and the normalization of raids, abductions, family separations, and deportations reached a confluence this summer. As protests against police brutality and systemic racism took place across the country, the president signed an executive order deploying federal agents to ostensibly protect monuments and federal buildings. And with Portland's protests focusing on the Mark O. Hatfield United States Courthouse, paramilitaries from ICE, CBP, and other DHS agencies entered the city.
Came out here dressed in t-shirts and doing hula hoops and stuff, and they started gassing us. So we came back with respirators, and they started shooting us. So we came back with vests, and they started aiming for the head. So we started wearing helmets, and now they call us terrorists.
It's like a tailor-made process for an authoritarian like Donald Trump to come and decide that to now use these authorities that are available to him with the Department of Homeland Security. When it gets set up in 2003, there isn't a sense that its mission has anything to do primarily with protecting federal buildings, let alone having any kind of role against protests.
As footage of people being abducted off the street spread, the Trump administration threatened to send the same forces to other places, like Chicago and Cleveland. And despite the protests of local officials, DHS agents continued to battle protesters for weeks in Portland.
Earlier this week, I called not only the mayor, but the governor. I offered DHS support to help them locally address the situation that's going on in Portland. And their only response was, please pack up and go home. And that's just not going to happen on my watch.
The legitimacy of American institutions is supposed to come from the consent of the governed. And now we're seeing that consent revoked, seeing it treated as conditional, seeing it ultimately treated as disposable when it comes into contrast with the Trump administration's agenda. Unless this is actively rolled back, this is going to be a very powerful precedent for future administrations.
In less than 20 years, the war on terror's tools have been honed and developed by both Republicans and Democrats. They've gone from being seen as needed only for extraordinary threats to being deployed on unarmed protesters on America's streets. If elected officials don't change these rules soon, could we see more of these tools used on Americans?